He told them the twins were 9. But the truth is they were born dead. That was the first line of the sealed letter found beneath the altar floorboard in Pine Hollow's ruined church. Written in a hand no one could identify, dated 3 years before the Morrison family ever arrived. But it gets worse. Inside that envelope was a small lock of braided hair, blonde, identical in shade to the Morrison girls. DNA didn't exist in 1834, but the chill that runs down your spine when truth outpaces logic, that has always existed. This is not a ghost story. This is a psychological event buried beneath 2 centuries of silence. A real case, a real journal, real names, and real evidence that some knowledge cannot be learned. It must be remembered, even if the memory doesn't belong to you. In the hills of Kentucky, in 1824, a decade before Ezekiel Morrison brought his daughters to Pine Hollow, another set of twins died under circumstances so traumatic the entire community swore a blood vow to erase the past. And they nearly did, until a man with 2 daughters who should not have known anything began describing the details of crimes that were supposedly never spoken aloud. Rachel and Rebecca Morrison were not ordinary children. Their knowledge wasn't psychic, it was surgical, specific, time-stamped, geographically anchored. They described floorboards that squeaked, closets that stank of mildew, and dreams that carried names from the dead. But here's what they never told the townspeople. They had been having the dreams since they were 5. And in the dreams, they were never themselves. The mirror would lie. The voice would change. The sisters would switch names without realizing it. One would speak and the other would taste iron in her mouth. Visions of fire, of ropes, of shallow graves lined with wood ash and bird hymnals. This story doesn't begin with the Morrison twins arriving in 1834. It begins with a question no one dared ask. What if these girls weren't sent to remember the past, but to finish what had been started? If you think you've heard dark stories before, I warn you this one changes you. They called them angel twins, not because they were holy, but because no one could explain how they knew. They knew about miscarriages never spoken aloud, about marriages built on blackmail, about a child buried without a name on the far end of the cemetery, a burial that never appeared in any church record. Rebecca and Rachel Morrison weren't performing tricks. They weren't guessing. They were remembering. But it was what they remembered that terrified the community, because it wasn't just personal sins. It was institutional ones. They knew about the Whitman fire, the one the town claimed had taken the lives of an entire family in a tragic accident 16 years earlier. But the girls didn't call it a fire. They called it a cleansing. They said Hope and Faith Whitman hadn't burned alive. They had been strangled, right there in the church basement, and their father Jacob, they said, he didn't die in the fire either. They said he watched. Ezekiel Morrison never told them those things. He insisted he hadn't spoken of them, hadn't read them, hadn't dreamed them. But the girls wrote names in their sleep, full names, birth dates, injuries, scars. They said one man in Pine Hollow had a scar above his right hip, shaped like a twisted cross. That it wasn't from a farming accident, but from a ritual held behind the altar when he was 11. They named the man. They named the others who watched. They even described the shape of the rope used. The congregation began to fracture. Some wept and confessed. Others packed their families and fled in the dead of night. But a few, the ones whose secrets the twins hadn't yet exposed, became desperate. They begged Ezekiel to leave. They offered him food, money, safe passage. But he refused. He believed his daughters were a gift. He called them mirrors of the soul. He didn't realize they were also triggers. Rachel had begun speaking in her sleep, not in her own voice, but in that of a child who begged to be let out of the ground, who remembered the rope, the dark, the hymn that played during the final breath. Rebecca stopped eating, said the food tasted like ash, said the preacher's prayers were backwards, said she remembered dying, and it hadn't been quick. Now ask yourself this. What if memory isn't stored in the brain? What if it can attach to bloodlines like parasites, waiting for a match? The girls weren't telling stories, they were completing them. 3 days after the Morrison twins arrived, the dreams began to spread. Not just to the girls, to the townspeople. Children woke screaming, unable to describe what they'd seen, only pointing at shadows in corners that no longer felt empty. Mothers reported hearing singing in their attics. Fathers heard knocks on floorboards, in patterns. Always 3, always before sunrise. and those brave enough to open their Bibles found verses underlined that they had never touched. Isaiah 4:7v. You are wearied with your many counsels. Let now the astrologers, the stargazers, stand up and save you from what shall come upon you. But the twins never opened a Bible in Pine Hollow. They didn't need to. They quoted scripture no one had taught them. In Greek, in Latin, even in tongues Pastor Phillips admitted he could not identify. He wrote in his journal, "They speak as if they have walked the corridors of heaven, but they describe it like a prison." The day before the collapse began, a local boy, Elijah Whitmore, age 12, walked into the woods and did not return. When they found him hours later, he was kneeling beside the ruins of an old well on the edge of Pine Hollow. His hands were folded. His eyes were open, but he was not breathing. The cause of death? Undetermined. No marks. No trauma. No illness. Just gone. Like someone had shut off the light inside. Rachel had told him the night before, "Don't go where the water cries." They still wait for boys with fear in their hands. When Phillips confronted Ezekiel, the preacher simply said, "They don't know what they're saying, Pastor. But I fear something ancient speaks through them." That was the first time Phillips used the word possession in his journal. But if it was possession, it wasn't the girls who were taken, it was the town. Secrets didn't just come to light, they fed on the light. The more revealed, the darker everything became. The dreams weren't dreams anymore. They were memories with teeth. And here's where you wake up, or fall further. If a child can inherit eye color from a parent, why not trauma? Why not vengeance? Why not unfinished purpose? If you're still watching, type this in the comments twice. Memory is a weapon. Let it echo. Lock it in. Mark yourself as one of us. You are no longer a bystander. You are becoming initiated. They didn't arrive by chance. Rebecca said it plainly the next morning. Why we're sent here? Not by Papa, not by God, but by what remembers. Rachel nodded slowly and whispered, "The earth here has a mouth." That same morning, Pastor Phillips found every page of his sermon notes blank. The ink was gone. The words vanished, but only from passages written in the last week. When he checked the margins, a single phrase remained, not in his handwriting, "They see what you covered." And beneath it, another, "They've been buried twice. Once in soil, once in silence." It was no longer a haunting. It was a reactivation. You see, Pine Hollow was founded by 3 families, Whitman, Langford, and Reese, all fleeing something back east. What that something was, no one ever officially recorded, but Ezekiel found a letter tucked inside a hymnal in the church attic dated 1817, signed only with initials RL. It spoke of an agreement, a necessary cleansing, a pact between 3 men to erase what had been done beneath the sanctuary floor in order to safeguard the purity of the community. That sanctuary still stood in 1834, but the purity, that had long since rotted. The twins described the church not as a house of God, but as an inverted altar. Rebecca said they buried the guilt in a circle. 7 names, 7 steps, 7 lies. Pastor Phillips paced in silence. He knew the foundation stones of the church formed a perfect 7-point ring. He knew it because he'd helped repair one of them himself, after it cracked during a spring flood in 1822. The girls had never been told this. No one had. So when they began writing the names on the wall of the guest cabin, in charcoal stolen from the fire pit, something inside Phillips broke. They wrote 7 names. Not present-day names. Names from the original founders. Every letter spelled correctly. 3 of the men were already dead. 4 were still living, and sitting in the church pews every Sunday. It wasn't just trauma being inherited. It was reckoning. And reckoning has a clock. Ask yourself, what if the dead don't just rest? What if they're scheduled? Pine Hollow was never supposed to be found. It was a test site, not for sermons, but for silence. The church never officially acknowledged the settlement. There are no baptism records, no ordination papers, no public correspondence. As far as the state archives were concerned, Pine Hollow didn't exist in 1834. And yet, when Ezekiel sent a letter detailing what his daughters had begun to uncover, he received a response from Lexington, unsigned, delivered by hand, no return address. It said, "You are not authorized to disturb what was laid down by those who came before. Control your daughters, or we will." He burned the letter. But Phillips didn't. He kept a copy of its contents in the margins of his journal. Next to it, he wrote only 2 words, "They're watching." That week, a stranger arrived. He wasn't a preacher. He wasn't a traveler. He claimed to be a representative of the missionary board. But his hands were too clean, his boots too new, and his questions too surgical. He asked the twins if they'd read anything about the Chorazin doctrine, an obscure theological thesis banned from the Southern Baptist Seminary in 1792 for describing what it called the architecture of divine silence. They hadn't, but Rachel said something that made the man freeze. Chorazin was told to forget, but forgetting is a sin too. The man left that night. He was never seen again. The next morning, the twins were found outside, kneeling in the frost, writing in ash on the church wall. Chorazin fell because it hid its dead in the altar. That was when Phillips snapped. He searched the crawl space beneath the sanctuary floor, and he found them. 3 boxes, small, rotten, unmarked. Inside, fragments of fabric, teeth, bone, not enough for adults, far too small. The journal does not describe what happened next in detail, only that Phillips locked the church doors for 3 days and rang no bell on Sunday. When asked why, he said, "You don't preach when the devil holds communion." And if you're still listening, you already know. This was never about one town. It was about whether the church had the power to erase memory or just bury it. Rebecca stopped answering to her name. She called herself Hope, but Rachel said nothing. But when she stared at her sister, tears filled her eyes. Not with confusion, but recognition. They weren't pretending. Something ancient had woken up. Hope and Faith Whitman, the twin girls allegedly burned in the accidental fire of 1818. The girls whose names had been buried by the town, the church, and the founding families, had come back. Not as ghosts, not as hallucinations, as inheritance. It wasn't reincarnation. It was something older, something crueler. Memory without consent, identity without escape. Phillips began referring to it in his journal as the Whitman loop, a cycle where unresolved justice seeks compatible vessels. The twins were never the target. They were the doorway, and that door was now wide open. Rebecca began drawing the church layout from 1818, a layout that matched the forbidden blueprints kept in the Lexington Theological Archives. Rachel began singing lullabies only Mary Whitman had known, lullabies preserved in a 1796 hymnal no one had access to in Pine Hollow. And then came the night of the mirror. Phillips found the girls standing before the church mirror, but only one reflection was visible. Rachel's. Rebecca stood there too, but cast no reflection. Phillips recorded it this way. I asked Rebecca why her image was gone. She smiled and said, because Hope never had one. She was buried before she was seen. That same night, all 7 members of the church council received identical dreams of fire, ash, and a voice whispering, "What was silenced will now speak." 4 of them fled the next day, 3 stayed. The ones who stayed, their names matched the founding signatures from 1818, direct bloodlines, and their children started dreaming too, but not of monsters, but of rituals, ropes, altars, a stone circle in the woods where no trees grow, where one twin always lives, and the other always dies. That's the design. One remembers, one returns. The question is, which is which? And if you're still here, you're not the same man who started this video. You're no longer curious. You're called. They left the town the same way they came. No warning, no goodbyes, no trace. Just 2 sets of footsteps leading away from the Pine Hollow Church. One set stopped after a mile, the other kept walking. And for years after, the locals whispered, which girl stayed behind? Because only one ever appeared again. And she never used her name. She traveled under aliases, moved from town to town, preached without being ordained, delivered messages she claimed weren't hers, spoke of futures she shouldn't have known. But she never aged. And everywhere she went, secrets came to light. Churches collapsed, families fractured, burials were exhumed, confessions were carved into stone before anyone admitted guilt, and always, always, the signs followed her. 7 stones, a burned hymnal, a mirror with no reflection. She was not a prophet, she was the return. And here's the final truth no one in Pine Hollow wanted to face, not Pastor Phillips, not Ezekiel Morrison, not even the girl who survived. The church didn't silence a demon, it trained one. Pine Hollow was a prototype, a behavioral trial built to see if memory could be bound to bloodline, if guilt could be passed like a gene, if truth could be weaponized and then controlled. But the experiment failed. The memory fought back, not with rage, but with precision. The twins were the last test subjects, but not the last carriers. That's why this story still exists, not in books, not in sermons, but in you. Because if you're still watching this, something in you recognizes it. You've felt it. The shadow in the hallway. The silence that follows a lie. The dream that ends with a voice that isn't yours. This wasn't entertainment. It was extraction. We've told the story. Now it lives in you. So if you've seen the 7 stones, if you've dreamed of the circle where trees don't grow, if you've ever looked in the mirror and felt like something else was staring back, you already know the truth. One remembers, one returns, and the third one watches. That's you. Welcome to the memory.